Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my delight to welcome you this evening to our first event of the academic year as a center in the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas series. Before I introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker for this evening, a couple announcements. We actually have the beginnings of a rather busy season at the Schusterman Center. Next week on Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock in Avaya Auditorium, Dr. Elizabeth Minich will be here to speak on her recent book, The Evil of Banality, on the life and death of importance of liberal education. Those of you may have seen an event with Dr. Daniel Christmas also on Tuesday evening. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the events, so she won't be here on Tuesday evening. If that's on your calendar, we'll let you know as things are rescheduled. On Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock in the Middle Eastern Studies Reading Room in Calhoun 516, we have a reception for our Israel Institute teaching fellow, Dr. Ahmed Agbaria, for his new book, The Politics of Arab Authenticity, a new monograph on Arab intellectual history. I invite you to join us for any and all of these events if you are able, and to check out the Schusterman Center's website for a rather full events calendar this fall. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, who is the Gale Professor of Jewish Arts and Culture and a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Study, and also the director of the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in Americas, to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the first in-person event of the Gale Collaborative for Jewish Studies for Jewish in the Americas. We've been doing online things for the past 2 years, and now Laura Levitt has joined us in person. So we're extremely delighted to have her, particularly since she could be here in person. And we've been admiring her work for a long time, talking of bringing her here. She is professor of religion, Jewish studies, and gender at Temple University, where she's chaired the religion department and directed both the Jewish studies and the gender, sexuality, and women's studies programs, currently free of administrative posts, right?
Currently free of administrative posts.
And she's the author of The Objects That Remain, that book, American Jewish Loss After the Holocaust, Jews and Feminism, The Ambivalent Search for Home, and she's co-editor of Impossible Images, Contemporary Art After the Holocaust, and Judaism Since Gender. So we're just incredibly delighted to have her here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. And if people see people at the door, just let them come in. It's really fine. And I am really, it is a delight to be here. And it's been a pleasure to be a guest in Susie's wonderful course last night, or late yesterday afternoon, and then the workshop earlier today. You have such a wonderful group of faculty and students, graduate and undergraduate students. Just a pleasure to be around smart, thoughtful, wonderful students. And so I'm sure that this group will undoubtedly be more of that wonderfulness. So I thank you very much. So let me just say, this talk is a kind of meld of, I would say, my most recent book, that's this one, The Objects That Remain, and the book before this, which is American Jewish Loss After the Holocaust. And you can see that the title kind of brings them together. And I really wanted to think about questions of Holocaust memory in an American context. And so that's really where this talk comes from. I did want to say that I gave a version of this talk when I was in Poland in May, and since then I was also at the Holocaust Museum this summer and got to go through the permanent exhibit, which has shifted a little bit. And so some of the things that I'm bringing to the talk today are informed by those most recent visits. So I will be reading because I want to kind of stay on point, and I'll be showing some images as we go. But it is a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation. So So I speak to you about the future of Holocaust commemoration today as we find ourselves at a crossroad, at the very precipice where memory and history meet, the very moment when those who have so powerfully told their stories and lived their lives after such horror are coming to the last of their full lives. And although this is true across the globe, what I want to talk to you about today is how the Holocaust has been remembered and commemorated in the United States. I want to consider what is at stake at this historical crossroad by thinking about the term after as not just after the war or after the Shoah, but as memory becomes history. I want to share with you how the Holocaust has been remembered in the United States in the past and how it might be remembered going forward. I also want to think about how the loss that is the Shoah is experienced and understood in relation to other losses, not as competitive memories, but rather in terms of how different losses touch and what prompts those memories, the people, but also increasingly the objects that occasion those efforts. So having given a version of this talk in Poland recently, and having gone to Auschwitz for the first time, I come to you today more keenly aware of how much of what I have to say about Holocaust commemoration at this crossroad between history and memory is shaped by the rich and powerful legacy of so many survivors who came to North America and not only made their lives here, but also shared their stories. Although I will talk about the growing power of objects and acts of remembrance, here in the United States especially, given that, being in Poland, not only in Auschwitz, but also in Krakow and in Warsaw, where so many objects remain, where the very streets and even the landscapes are filled with this horrible past, I'm struck by how, without an abiding community of survivors, the objects cannot speak for themselves. They can only come to life or become animate as we connect them to those people who have told their stories. And I do think that what I'm talking about really is quite specific to North America. It may be true in some other places, but not in Poland. And I think that that's really important to say. So let me begin by asking the question, what is commemoration? So commemoration, I believe, is an invitation. It is addressed to all of us who hope to keep memory meaningful and compelling in an ever-shifting present. So for this afternoon or this evening, I'm asking you to begin to imagine something a bit different from what we have known thus far in the commemoration of the Holocaust. A new vision that builds on and respectfully appreciates how indebted we are to the work of so many for so long who made the Holocaust or the Shoah a part of our collective memories as Jews and as Americans and as citizens of the world. And again, I want to stress how indebted we are to the efforts of so many dedicated people, all of those who made the Holocaust a universal as well as a particular legacy. So to do this, I want to suggest that we cannot afford to take for granted anything that we have learned thus far. We cannot be content that we already know what it means to, quote, never forget. And so I want to share some thoughts with you about how we might see Holocaust memory as alive, a living entity that grows and changes over time, a legacy that is not afraid to confront new generations with new knowledges and insights into this horrific past, insights that come out of an ongoing engagement, theirs, yours, mine, and ours. So some background. My own scholarly work on Holocaust is a part of a long-standing American conversation about Holocaust memory and questions of representation and commemoration. And so this scholarly conversation does not presuppose that never forgetting is a foregone conclusion or that the need to remember the Holocaust is itself a self-evident proposition. And of course, this is all the more so in the contemporary moment in which we find ourselves, certainly since the beginning of the last presidential regime in the United States. Instead, in this scholarly tradition, my remarks today are an intervention into the question of how to keep Holocaust memory alive for generations increasingly removed from the immediacy of those historic events. So by arguing against certain truisms in the commemoration of the Holocaust, like never forget, mine is, as I've said, an invitation into the future of Holocaust memory. I ask how we might keep commemorative and historical sites like the Holocaust Museum in Washington and gatherings like this one compelling and important to audiences, visitors, and viewers who are and are not the children or the grandchildren of survivors, Jews and non-Jews, citizens, all of our collective humanity, whose precious relationship to these horrific events are increasingly mediated by time as they approach the rich sources and resources, testimonies, histories, films, memoirs, museums, memorials, and so many varied works of imagination that survivors and first generations have made available to all of us. We are their heirs. This works this way. Because I'm concerned about the future of commemoration, I am especially interested in addressing the vast majority of those who now visit places like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, including most Jewish visitors who come without such intimate connections to the Holocaust. And towards this end, my remarks today begin by challenging what have become, again, set ways of engaging Holocaust memory. So two things. The 2 points have to do with reverence, assuming a particular position as if there is only one way to engage with this past, and 2, how we are supposed to deal with other losses in relation to the Holocaust. So, reverential stance. I want to suggest that there is not only one appropriate way of showing reverence and engaging with this past. Instead, there are a range of honest and meaningful emotions and reactions one can have in commemorating the legacy of the Holocaust. I want to rule out nothing. I don't want to prescribe decorum or present only didactic lessons, in other words. I refuse to assume that there is only one single lesson that one must learn. Rather, I want to imagine a renewed openness to curiosity and critical engagement, including the unexpected insight. The strange, the surprising, and perhaps even the irreverent is important to me because I see these as channels, new ways into Holocaust memory for new generations who come with fresh eyes and very different orientations in the world, especially those born well after the war and now well after the 20th century. I assume this is like many of the brilliant students here at the University of Texas. What I'm proposing is a challenge to the common reverential stance that most American Jews and other Americans have performed and know intimately in relation to Holocaust commemoration, as it has been practiced so powerfully in the past. And as a corollary to that stance comes something else that I believe impedes our efforts to keep this memory alive, and that has to do with how American Jews have deferred all other losses, again well-meaningly, to the enormity of the Shoah. Ordinary losses have been considered insignificant in the face of the Holocaust. And although this was and is a well-meaning and significant stance, my argument is that the static nature of this approach precludes a living engagement with the Shoah. It does not allow new generations and people with various and diverse backgrounds to engage with the Holocaust on their own terms. By contrast, I ask us to be mindful of how different losses touch and how the proximity of the pain of others can enable a different kind of commemoration and ongoing engagement. So thus far, the stance we have come to know presumes the following. In places like the museum in Washington, other losses must pale in comparison and otherwise be deferred. So I'm questioning this stance precisely because I'm not convinced of its ability to bring others into this particular historical legacy. My concern is with the exclusivity of precisely this well-meaning stance of deferral, its lack of elasticity, its inability to speak to or compel generations further removed from the Shoah to engage as meaningfully as they possibly can with this powerful legacy. So what does this mean to keep Holocaust memory alive? Such remembrance entails a risk. And I'm thinking of Susie's work. We were talking about risk yesterday, and as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of a conversation she and I had. So here the risk is of allowing all kinds of visitors to bring their own ghosts with them to sites of Holocaust commemoration. Not to conflate these memories with the Holocaust and its victims, but rather to let these different losses touch each other. And here I'm thinking actually of the work of Dr. Christmas, who was a fellow at the museum on a workshop a few years ago with me, who writes about the legacy of slavery in relation to Holocaust. And I think it's very powerful work, and I hope she'll make it here. So this touching offers a new possibility for keeping the legacy of the Holocaust alive. This touching is key to what I'm calling living memory, a form of memorialization which is plastic rather than static, and as such very much, as I say, alive. In making this move, I build on the important work of literary scholar Marianne Hirsch and her notion of post-memory. As Hirsch has eloquently explained, post-memory is layered and belated, like other postmodern, post-war, post-colonial, post-memory. Quote, post-memory reflects an uneasy oscillation between continuity and rupture. It is not a movement, method, or idea. Rather, she argues that it is a structure of intergenerational and transgenerational return of traumatic knowledge and an embodied experience. It is a consequence of traumatic recall, but unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, it happens at a generational remove. In other words, Hirsch's notion of post-memory points precisely to the mediated and indirect but still compelling ways that those of us who come after, next generations, can and do powerfully remember this traumatic past and can even experience it in our bodies, albeit at least at a generational or many generations, increasingly many generations removed. And like Hirsch, I'm especially moved by the way that artists engage in visual culture and poets and creative writers who use words all help us touch these memories through their art. In my own writing, I've reconsidered how some of the visual works of second gen and next generations artists like Art Spiegelman and Lori Novak, for example, exemplify what this touching looks like. Some of you may already know this image from Spiegelman's Meta Mouse collection. And I take this image from the cover of another powerful scholarly work that asks questions about the transmission of Holocaust memory. Literary scholar Michael Rothberg's first book, Traumatic Realism, and I would just suggest that you check out his multidirectional memory and his now work on implication. But I do want to also return to this first image of the cover of his first book, Traumatic Realism. So on the cover is Art Spiegelman, the cartoonist, the child of survivors, his attempt to capture the complicated ways that he knows his parents' stories, the ways that he comes to these stories belatedly and through the mediation of his own craft and imagination as a cartoonist. And here he reminds us, his readers, and that he cannot give us direct access to even his own father's story. To write, to draw his opus mouse, he must put on a mask, the mouse mask of his tale. Art Spiegelman uses the figure of the vulnerable mouse to unlock the story, to approach it, to come closer, and yet here he shows us vividly his struggle, because for him, mice, and even rats that allow him to get closer to his father's story are all overdetermined. As animating drawings, they are haunted by a cultural landscape already filled with ideas about mice, including most especially Mickey Mouse, whose presence here is a reminder of how difficult it is to find a way in. And yet for Spiegelman, mice and comics are all, nevertheless, serious business. The demand of Holocaust representation for all of us who come after is to remember and honor the distance that separates us from those who lived and died in Europe. We must make the effort even as we acknowledge our own limitations. These too need to be a part of the pictures we draw and the narratives we tell. So here's another example. This is Lori Novak's past lives. Novak was born into a Jewish but not a survivor family in America, well after the war, and she uses projections to show us vividly how memory works. In this 1987 work entitled Past Lives, Novak makes visible the ways memories are layered, overlapping and interconnected. In this haunting image, we see the faces of children, Jewish children in hiding in France. We see another image, the face of a woman, and then interlaid with these images, we see the artist as a young child held in the arms of her mother, a mid-20th century quintessentially American image. Writing about this photograph, Novak explains the context of its production. It was the time of the trial of Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie, she writes. The floating projected image in Past Lives is of a group of children hidden in a boarding school in Izou, France, who were then deported by Barbie and sent to their deaths in a concentration camp. The photo was widely published and became a symbol of Barbie's crimes against humanity. I was haunted by this smiling image of the children. Past Lives is dedicated to their memory. In my projected collage, she writes, images of Ethel Rosenberg, the children from Izou, and me clutching my mother merge. I become the recipient of the weight of my cultural past. In this way, Novak invites all of us to claim the weight of our various cultural pasts, including the Holocaust. Building on Novak's example, we each take on the legacies of our various pasts in commemoration. Here, the artist shows us how this often happens. The meaning of these juxtaposed images is neither simple nor set. Each of us brings our own memories and experiences, our personal and collective histories, to these encounters. And works like Spiegelman's and Novak's help us appreciate and confront this complicated process. Again, they're not covering over each other, but you can see them at different angles. These artistic works in particular have helped me understand more fully my own response to Jaffa Eilich's photographic memory, The Tower of Faces, at the museum in Washington. They have helped me appreciate how perhaps an alternative form of remembrance can and does work in relation to this extraordinary memorial, a tower made of once ordinary objects, family and communal photographs. And as I will now explain the familiarity of these objects, and for many American Jews, those whose families came to the United States from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924, our familiarity with these depictions draw us to this memorial. Inside the tower, we're flooded with all kinds of memories. We're reminded of our own family photographs, perhaps. This was certainly my experience, in their similarity to and their difference from these images. And instead of trying to rid ourselves of some of these connections that are not exclusively Holocaust related, we might be better served to observe how these different legacies overlap and intermingle with the legacies of other times and other places, like Novak's image. The energy and power of these layers is itself animating. In other words, it is the intermingling that stimulates a desire to want to know more, to probe more deeply and to look more closely, and in so doing, I believe, to keep the legacy of the Holocaust vivid and compelling as we continue to live in an ever-changing present. So in order to appreciate how the future may be more fully alive with memory, I want to share with you a bit of my own sustained engagement with the Tower of Faces. And I then want to explain how this experience connects back to living memory, this time as a kind of liturgical practice. And then I'm going to conclude my remarks with an example or two of other objects that enact and enable this kind of lively interaction and critical engagement. So this section is called Living Memory, the Tower of Faces, and Holocaust Memory. So in writing about my return to the museum in American Jewish Loss after the Holocaust, I became aware of the ways in which our engagements with Holocaust monuments and memorials and museums change over time. Revisiting Eilich's photographic memorial after many years and much writing and thinking, I was struck by how differently I experienced this compelling memorial. I saw things I had not previously seen, while more familiar elements of the memorial became less compelling. As a way of explaining, I drew an analogy to reading. So, quote, I wrote in that earlier book, like texts we read and reread, our ongoing encounters with monuments and memorials are also not static. We see and experience different things over time. Our interpretations and critical engagements change, unquote. I then went on to think about this insight in relation to what it means to keep memory of the Holocaust alive. So by acknowledging this dynamic, I argued we need to be open to how even these narratives change over time. And I explained, in other words, as I did in my return to the Tower of Faces and the museum, we continue to learn new things from these encounters. We are forever reminded of the ongoing interplay between remembering and forgetting. In both forgetting and remembering, the past continues to change. It becomes something dynamic. It changes with us. Given this, our efforts to commemorate the Holocaust must also remain alive and capable of changing. And it's this dynamic that I'm calling living memory. And it's related intimately to how many contemporary Jews identify as Jews through our engagement with various Jewish past, including the Holocaust, but not only the Holocaust. So for me, there's something both animating and resonant in this notion of living memory. It captures something vital and important about contemporary Jewish life, particularly in the United States. In part, it is the tension between the past and the present that speaks to me as memory opens up into that changing present. What is carried forward, the various layers and sediments of other times and other places? What are the traces that texture our contemporary understandings and in turn inform how we live our lives now? Through these engagements with the past, memory is given new life, as we saw in Novak's past lives. What I come back to is the analogy and the connection between this process of revisiting and reimagining the past and what I described in that last book as a kind of reading practice. This begins to make more sense in a Jewish context when we consider the liturgical practice of reading and rereading sacred texts. This reading practice, the return to sacred text in the liturgical calendar through cycles of Torah readings, or the return to specific liturgies on holidays, carry the promise of speaking to us in the present, and especially I'm thinking about Passover in a Jewish context. We're commanded to remember the story of the Exodus, as well as the stories of the tellings and the retellings of this narrative. Again, even for those of us who are secular Jews, these liturgical reenactments are powerful and compelling because they are both familiar and new. In this way, they too point to what I'm calling living memory. Yes, let me go to this next one. For me, this is a deeply appealing notion because it insists on the importance of the relationship between texts, the work of art, an object, and the reader or viewer. It's an interaction that is both performative and dynamic. The obligation in these liturgical enactments is to interact in the present and not to discount all of the layers and textures that inform our experience in the present. It is never just about the Exodus from Egypt in that Passover experience. It is that and so much more, always more. And this is what happens in places like the Tower of Faces. So in my first encounter, I was taken by the familiarity of these images, the men and women of a certain era, their proximity to my own Eastern European Jewish family, our past, our family photographs, and the albums then being reminded, and then being reminded of how distant my family images were from those depicted here. How fortunate my relatives were not to have been there. So as I returned to the tower years later, I was struck differently by the memory of my initial identification with these photographs and how much I worried as I looked again, this time, about those whose images were outside of my gaze. I found myself strangely concerned about those whose pictures made up the far reaches of the tower. I ended up talking to the photography curator at the museum about the future of this memorial. I did that then, and this is now a number of years ago. I asked if there were plans at that time in the works to either move the images around so that no one depicted gets lost or goes unseen, Or if the museum might someday make all of these photographs available electronically. In other words, someday might a computer image of the tower allow visitors to touch a screen and learn what we can about each and every one of the photographs that make up this tower. Strangely enough, this August I returned again to the museum for a series of meetings to organize a summer workshop. I will be co-leading next summer on tending to sacred objects. And so as a part of our work, we revisited the permanent exhibit. And permanent exhibits are not necessarily permanent, right? They change too. And as I've just described, I was again struck by the difference between how I remembered key elements of the exhibit and what I was experiencing on this visit. With an eye towards the sacred, I was struck by pieces I had completely missed in the past and unnerved by some of the actual changes underway. But what I want to share with you today is that having written about the Tower of Faces and my desire upon returning to it to learn more about those depicted in these photographs, I was moved to discover a brand new interactive element that has been added to the chamber inside the tower on the ground floor. We can now learn the fate of some of the members of this community. There are now a series of tablets at waist level at various points around the room. These tablets allow visitors to point at specific pictures, those primarily at eye level, and learn their stories. There is even a way to find connections among and between various photographs and those depicted in them. Although we do not have access to all of the photographs, these detailed stories are moving and compelling. They teach us about the individual lives lost. And this is a collected experience, a community made up of individuals, families, teams, and social groups. And the tablets now enable us to touch some of these groups and individuals and learn their stories. Traditions and memories, texts and memorials can and do become fresh and new as we return to them. Again, at institutions like the museum in Washington, where they are now revisited, where they're now revisiting even elements of their permanent exhibit. Part of the pleasure in these returns including on such occasions as this, are our memories of so many other Holocaust talks or commemorations that we have attended or otherwise participated in. It is the sedimentations, the textures and layers of different memories, as I say, the palm set of meaning that continue to shift and change as we engage in these practices year after year. And this means paying attention to the new and other voices who come to share these occasions with us. And in this case, what it means for me to share these musings with you here in Texas, having shared some of these remarks most recently in Poland. Although what were once vivid and compelling engagements may fade, the promise of living memory is that other interpretations or approaches become more salient. The Tower of Faces has gone digital, at least in part. None of these are fixed or permanent. All are additions to the repertoire. This is not about loss, it's about life. The traces of past engagements inform new ones. The ephemeral qualities of these engagements is what makes them bristle. Bringing new eyes to these memories is how we breathe new life into them. And for me, this capacity to read the same text differently, to engage with a work of art or other kinds of Holocaust objects in ways that change over time is what makes these activities exciting, compelling, and meaningful. And this is what it means to keep memory alive. So to engage with the past is not to pin it down, but rather to appreciate its animating character. And this is true not only for photographs or works of visual culture, but also with physical objects. And so to conclude my remarks, I want to turn to material objects held at the museum in Washington and in camps all across Poland to explain why I believe the objects are increasingly becoming critical to how Americans will continue to engage with Holocaust memory in the future. Using the model I've suggested, I now turn to the power of not just photographs, which are objects, but other once ordinary physical objects transformed by violence. Holocaust objects that serve as prompts of memory. And here I'm building on some of the work from the objects that remain. In the introduction to my book, I write about how in my last book I wrote about different Holocaust objects. Now you've heard about family photographs and the allure of those precious traces of life before. I wrote about holding and touching such photographs, the ways in which many people carried these images with them. And as I've done in this presentation, I wrote about these attachments in haptic terms, touching images, but I want to end this talk by briefly discussing how clothing and other material objects can be even that much more intimate than photographs, as, quote, these are objects that cover and hold our bodies. We wear these textiles, we live inside of them. The longer we inhabit them, the more of us they contain. As the poet Maggie Nelson suggests, millions of traces of our DNA in skin cells, sweat, piss, blood, saliva, tears permeate such garments. As I go on to say in the introduction to the objects that remain, I discuss my own shock at seeing for the first time up close an intricate prisoner uniform being mended at the museum's offsite facility. An image like the one that you see on the screen, I guess behind you. I'm looking at it in front of me, but it's behind me. I wrote, clothing that is worn day in and day out for long periods of time is also marked in a different way. It is shaped by our bodies. Not only were these uniforms worn constantly, but because they were handed out haphazardly, they often did not fit, and so were carefully, to the best of their ability, of course, tailored by the very prisoners who wore them, who used whatever was at hand to try to make them fit. The uniform jacket I saw being mended was unusual in its intricate tailoring. It was altered to fit a specific person. The camp uniforms held in the museum collection are so fragile that careful efforts must be made simply to keep them from disintegrating. And because the bodies of those who inhabited these garments have been missing for so long, and I'm really just citing from the book here in the introduction, in order to preserve them, to keep them from falling apart, each uniform has its own body-shaped hanger. These effigies are custom fit. They are specifically made for each jacket, shirt, or pair of pants. These stuffed, mannequin-like hanging figures help take the stress off fragile seams and frayed panels. The prisoners are gone, but the hangers convey a semblance of their presence. In reverse logic, the bodies beneath the fabric protect the garment, not the other way around. I go on to talk about the power of such objects as, quote, the witnesses to the atrocities performed on those who wore them. They attest to the crimes as historical and criminal evidence, offering silent testimony. The aura that emanates from these intimate garments are bound to the haptic, the lives they touched and held at that time and in that place. And this is also the case when we consider other pieces of clothing in the museum's collection. In a late chapter of my book, I offer an extended account of the objects held in the museum, but begin with a child's green sweater, the one behind me. I will make this my last example, where again memory is prompted by the tactile, by touch and the intimacy of an object of clothing. This time not a prisoner uniform, but rather a handmade sweater, the gift of a beloved grandmother that was worn by a young child as she escaped the Nazi onslaught of the ghetto where she was living. This green sweater was worn for 14 months as Christine Karen hid in the sewers of Lviv, Poland. This object, which is now too fragile to be on display, was delicately packaged and is held in a temperature-controlled storage facility to preserve it. But its story continues to be told online at the museum's Curator Corner site that includes an interview between Karen and one of the museum's curators, Susie Snyder, who is an extraordinary curator who's been at the museum since 1992 when the museum opened. And I just believe that people need to do oral histories with those folks who started the museum and the incredible work they did and the stories that they have to tell are themselves absolutely extraordinary. I just had to kind of say this out loud and witness to their incredible, unbelievable stories. Let me go back to my text. So it is also remembered in the gift shop, in a book by Karen, as well as a knitting pattern kit that now enables visitors to recreate the sweater at home. Material objects like family photographs and pieces of clothing help us, and I'm going to use the language of justice here, something we kind of argued about a little bit at the workshop today, to this horrific past. As objects that were there then and are here now, they help us draw connections between then and now. They may serve as empirical evidence of some of the horrific crimes that were perpetrated, and they may also become empirical evidence in the work of historians. But as survivors age and are no longer with us, these material objects take on even more significance despite the fact that they may never go to court. They help us do justice to this past by allowing us to continue to tell stories, stories marked by the material presence of these often tainted objects. As such, material objects have increasingly, again, become central figures in recent works of historical fiction about the Shoah here in North America. These include works by Jonathan Safran Foer, Everything is Illuminated, or texts that focus on a lost necklace or a desk. Some of you may know which text I'm talking about. These tangible objects, like those that were owned, worn, or worked on by those no longer with us, take up space and help draw us back to that time and that place. These stories, the proliferation of tales about objects like Karen's sweater or the photographs that make up the Tower of Faces, help us again breathe new life into these pasts. The more stories we tell, the more animated the past becomes. This is the promise of holding such repositories of Holocaust objects, and how we might just do justice to this past and keep these memories alive. We do this work now at a crossroad, as I said, between what has been a living memory of the Shoah as experienced and told by survivors, and increasingly mediated landscape of history. As survivors continue to age and ultimately die, we scramble to touch this past. Although there are video testimonies and even hologramic ghosts among us, the tangible presence of objects that were there then and that are here now will, I believe, grow in importance, certainly here. Again, we could talk about Poland. I think it's a little different there without having had survivors and their stories. Their physicality, their tangible presence matters. This is about objects. Photographs as objects, pieces of clothing like Karen's sweater or that prisoner uniform I saw being mended at the offsite facility will continue to importantly link those of us working and living our lives in the present with those who were there then. But as I've suggested, objects do not speak for themselves. The challenge in Poland is clearly that problem. We bring these objects to life by paying attention to them, by telling stories about them that become the prompts of memory that occasion the telling of more and new stories. And so appreciating the ways narrative, the telling of these stories, can and do animate the past, offers one way of thinking about the future of Holocaust commemoration. The work of scholars and writers, artists and curators, and what they have to tell us about Holocaust objects, about those who wore them and carried them with them, or those who crafted or otherwise made them, are the stuff of many tellings. Objects have much to teach us if we allow ourselves to engage with them. If we bring our experiences, our knowledge, and our talents to these artifacts, they become animate. There is no one definitive story to tell. There are many tales, and only through the juxtaposition of these different stories might we continue to breathe new life into this past and its many stories. Thank you. So I'm happy to address comments and questions. I know there's a little bit of a polemic here, and I can explain more about if that's something you'd like. Yes, and name and say who you are.
Hi, I'm Olivia.
Hi, Olivia.
Thank you for your talk. That was fascinating. I have a question about the green sweater that you showed.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you. The fact that there's like a kit to make your own, I was kind of wondering, do you think that dilutes the significance of the object itself? I guess my other question is, what would it be appropriate to do with the sweater that you make yourself? Like, if a grandmother knit one, could a child wear it, or would that be completely out of
Again,
touch?
I think these are really complicated questions, and I appreciate you're going right there. And I don't know if any of you are knitters or do handwork. I have a colleague, Jody Eichler-Levine, who's written about crafting American Judaism and really talked about this. And so it's a way of kind of living with the past through this repetitive experience. And I also write about a piece, an architectural piece called The Evidence Room. And it was part of the 2016 Architectural Biennale in Venice. And it was the work of Robert Jan van Pelt and this team from the Waterloo College of Architecture. And they are very committed to the ethics of architecture. And so what they did, so some of you may know that Van Pelt is a forensic architect who has written extensively about Auschwitz. He's like an expert on Auschwitz. And as part of the curriculum at Waterloo, they begin by talking about the ethics of architecture by talking in this like required course for all of their students, and they learn about Auschwitz. And it's a way of thinking about like, what is it that architects and engineers who put together this architecture of destruction, right? This architecture of horror. And what they did was they created this room, the evidence room, and what they did is so Van Pelt was a key witness in the Deborah Lipstadt trial about Holocaust denial. David Irving, the Holocaust denier, it was a libel suit against Deborah Lipstadt for calling him a Holocaust denier. It was a very big deal, the early 20th century. It's the film Denial, if you haven't seen it. It's actually a pretty good film. Van Pelt was a key witness because he explained, if you see the vents in the top, that the crematoria existed, because this is part of the argument. And so he had also had access to, for his work, once the Soviet Union fell, their archives of material evidence. And so his testimony was built on that evidence. And what they did is they took the key documents from his testimony, and they took those documents and they made them tactile, right? So they scanned them, and then they made them into plaster, right? And so you could sort of touch them. And the room was made up of that evidence, this like tactile, and it was all white. And, so depending on how the light hit it, you could sort of see some of it. There were photographs, there were plans, right? So architectural plans and engineering plans. And then they reconstructed from that evidence the flue where the gas came down, and I don't know if you know, I mean, these are very creepy things, but the door to the gas chamber, they made it so that it opened out because there were all of these bodies, so they couldn't open in. And then the sadistic Nazis in charge wanted to watch, so they put a peephole, a glass hole, and then they had to put metal around it because people were dying. They wanted to get out around it, and so they recreated the door. And in order to do that, there's a book on the construction of this, and so many of their students and so engineers and architects worked on this and spent a lot of time with those documents and with those materials, and then reconstructing these things, and the labor of doing that was this real act of critical engagement in a kind of visceral way. And I think that this is kind of what I think that knitting meant. And so in the process of writing this book, I was writing about the green sweater, and I was at a Jewish studies meeting in Washington, D.C., now a number of years ago, and I was telling a friend of mine who was flying in she teaches at the University of Buffalo, and I was sort of telling her about what I was writing about, and I started talking to her about the green sweater, and there was this moment where she said, wait, I was just on the plane with this woman, and she was a knitter. And it turned out that they were trying to kind of figure out like the best thing, and like the family was going to choose which was like the better like version of this. And so this woman was one of the test knitters for the green sweater thing. Wow. And I was like, I couldn't believe that she had just been on the plane. And I'm telling her this about my work. This is like, these are these, for me, signs in the universe that I'm like on the right track of what I'm doing. Like, okay, thank you. I know this sounds crazy. So I don't knit, first of all, one. And two, I don't know that I would want the little green sweater, and I don't know who I'd want to wear it. But I can imagine, like maybe you had, in your Jewish community center, you might have an exhibit and you might do that, or maybe it would be a way of trying to tell the tale to someone, again, for whom it's also abstract, right? That like this pattern came from a woman who died in the Holocaust, who had lovingly made this for her granddaughter, and her granddaughter was able to survive, and to show them the video, right, that is at the curator's corner, and to hear Karen tell her story, and to see a picture of her, to hear her interaction with the curator, could be very, very powerful, right? But I don't, there are ways in which it could be just terrible, and this is that sense of risk, right? I mean, people really, really wanted their like teddy bears, right? So there's this like teddy bear that's been on display, and they sell replicas of the teddy bear, like also like complicated. But how do you touch the past, right? And that need for the kind of physicality, that tactile piece. So I hope that helps a little bit. Sorry to kind of go on. Yes.
Hi. I thank you for your just really powerful talk. I also enjoyed your analysis of the importance of all these objects, and particularly the clothing. I also had a question about the green sweater. What do you think it means for the original, the true green sweater, to be locked away in a vault essentially and be kept at 20 degrees? Why, and for the public's only engagement with the artifact to be through videos on the website, or the pattern sold in the gift shop. But you talk about the importance of like the physicality of these objects and the objects themselves, but the object most people are like never even interact with it. So how do you think that impacts its power, and would it be diminished? Would the power of like the videos and the other ways that people interact with it be diminished if the object were to no longer be there?
It's a great question, and I thank you. I mean, it's a really hard question. So it was on exhibit in a traveling exhibit, and so I think they can do it on occasion. But if you were a scholar or an artist and you wanted to see it, you can come to the research facility and have access. And that's what I mean about the sort of promise of holding, right? This is my ode to archives and collections, right? Is that that it's possible, that it makes it possible. But the conservator, the conservators I talk to about this, it's very, very difficult because some people think when they go to the museum, not all of you have ever been there, but some of the rooms are very, they're dark, and people think, well, it's for effect. Well, actually, the stuff in the cases are really light sensitive. I mean, one of my favorite things is there are these wedding dresses that were made after the war, and they were, in DP camps, displaced persons camps, and they were made out of, what was available. So there were parachutes, and the parachutes were made out of nylon, and they're made by DuPont. I come from Delaware, so I was very kind of like, I know where they made this stuff. And the thing about nylon is it was not meant to last, and it is both sensitive to light and to touch. And so, and this is why I think about these, these kind of holding and containers as kind of reliquaries, is that in order to kind of preserve these dresses, they have these beautiful cases that kind of are the shape of the dress, because that, like the effigy that's holding it, and the shape of the container. And I just was so taken by that, right? So it's really hard. And the museum, as I said earlier today, was created in 1992 and really in response to Holocaust deniers in many ways. And that's why they were so obsessed with having, authentic artifacts and having lots of them, an excess of them to kind of prove it. But as these things change, and now I know who you are, Olivia, because I know your mother, who is a wonderful, brilliant philosopher, and so works on Levinas. So it's very nice to see. I've only seen you on Facebook, so it just took me a moment to kind of make that connection. Sorry to embarrass you, but I just couldn't help myself. Okay, where was I going with this? I think I got excited and I lost my train of thought. But one of the problems is if you have all this stuff on, so you have an excess of these things, and it's really important to the permanent collection. They weren't going to be an archive to begin with. They became that, which I think is a really good thing for the reasons I just said. But they're really grappling with what is it going to mean over time, because these objects are damaged, right? And their historical value is bound to their damagedness. And so at what point are they going to have to show replicas, right? And then what does that do with things? And this is one of my issues about the holograms, is that they have survivors talking. And they're like, they're hologram-ish things, right? And they're very sophisticated and they're incredibly well-meaning. But the thing about them is that they're interactive. So if you have the same survivor and you're using the same technique, and you have one in Jerusalem and you have one in LA and you have one in Washington, over time, because the way that the artificial intelligence works, in those different sites, they're going to create their own different memories of their interactions with people, like in different languages and in, and different questions over time. And so over time, you're going to have these holograms kind of maybe answering differently in different places, right? And they're the same person. And then my anxiety is like, and you're going to worry about Holocaust deniers? Oh my God, I'm really nervous about this. Meanwhile, there are so many hours of Holocaust testimonies and all of these different video testimonies that you could spend a lifetime watching. You would never get through them. Which is again itself such an incredibly humbling thing to think about. Both to be in awe of that we have so much, but then how to kind of work with that. So people have worked on search engines and finding devices, and they have their own, like, what's the scrim? How do you, like, what are you searching for? What doesn't get searched for, and how those change need to change over time. So these are some of the issues, but if it's only going to be hermetically sealed, that's a problem. And I think you're absolutely right about that. So what does it mean, Susie?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what Daniel was saying, because the power of actual objects is very important in museums, and in the whole idea of wonder, that you're actually looking at, if not touching, the real thing. So that you're talking about survivors, us living in a precarious moment where survivors are almost not with us at all anymore. The only ones who are with us are ones who are kids. But the objects also are disintegrating and dying and almost not with us. So there is something very precarious about this moment where we are losing both the real voices and the real objects, so that we're going to have to do something else, which is either rely on photographs of them or replicas of them or recordings of them, And I do wonder, in your beautiful talk about our need to be fluid and to be curious and to allow for different generations of what people bring to the situation, what happens when somebody who, is as far away from the Holocaust as I am to the Civil War.
Right, and there is this now.
And it's almost the same period of time, unfortunately, is greeted with nothing, not the actual object or the actual person.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the dilemma, right? I think. I think we have to kind of let's go back to Mouse, right? And so it's the mediation, right? And recognizing all of the scrims, right? Yeah. And really taking them seriously. But I also think it's I'm so taken by the ways in which young people, like many of you in this room, you have these very different relationships to material objects, to books, for example. Like physical books are a different thing, it's very hard to kind of talk about, well, what is a book, or what is an anthology, and what is a scholarly article, because they all come to us as PDFs, right? And so there's a kind of a kind of disconnect. And I don't want to say, oh, and back in the day it was so great. Let me just say, standing in front of a Xerox machine with coins in a library, I spent summers doing this, right, as a graduate student. And all that light and whatever, and then you'd get a little bit of my fingers on them. I mean, I had files of these things, and then my files were so full. I had like big file cabinets of this like material stuff, right? And I finally got to this point where I wanted to find something, and my files were so stuffed that it was easier for me to go online and get a new copy of it. And I was like, finally, I said, I can't keep all of this. It's crazy. I can't even find my own thing. Yeah, I know, you know what I'm saying. So I don't think that the past is better. I just think that we have to kind of recognize that's the sedimentation. So I want us to look at the layers. I want us to appreciate the layers. I want us, if you're working on something, this is the digital humanities thing too, right? So you can have access to a medieval text, right? But there is something to be said for going to the archive and actually seeing the text, right? Smelling what it smells like, seeing the sort of getting a feel for what the texture of the outside of the binding of the book look like, right? These are beautiful things. The conservator showed me a journal that was handmade by a partisan in the forest, and it has all this schmutz, all this dirt on it and everything, and that's kind of what makes it important. And she was complaining about they want to digitize everything, and then this is the other thing about digitization. So I'm old enough. Oh, CD-ROM. There's a technology. I can't even use a CD on my computer, right? That's 3 computers ago, right? I remember we took my family's, Super 8 and 8mm film, and we put them on DVDs. I have these DVDs. I also have the film, and I actually gave away the projector because my father always burnt the films on the projectors. I have anxiety about the projector, and so we have these technologies that are changing so fast. So we have the state of the art. It costs a lot of money to do these things, but then they change, right? And so she was complaining about they think you can just have this all online and it's great. But no, she says, you still need to, let me show you what this looks like. Or you want to see that milk can, where the Onyx Chavez archive was buried, and it's amazing. You have to see this rusted milk can that these people buried in the Warsaw Ghetto and that were actually found. That is just amazing. And in Warsaw, I had this young scholar who took me through the exhibit and could read the Polish and the Hebrew and the Yiddish and explain to me, and she's introducing me to all of these writers who are a part of the archive. They have them they're around a table in this in the historical archive, right? And you, like at each chair, you can pull out a thing and learn about the people. And for her, she knew them all. So I felt like, and she's like 40 years old. I mean, she wasn't there then, but she knows these people, and she told me these stories. And this one's husband was really a jerk, and what happened after the war, and and she's reading these documents that had been buried, and I'm standing there at the case with her, and she's explaining, this is a different version of this poem. Interested in this, and you go and you work at the center. You get they have teachers and school groups, and you can be a fellow. Undergraduates. They have a great program. So I just it's a wonderful place. That the new facility, as I was telling some of the students yesterday, is a little. I was so excited to go there, and I've been wanting to go, but because of COVID, I couldn't go. And so finally, I got there this summer, and I wanted to just be in love with it and excited about it, and it was kind of empty, and it was really sterile. It was like, and this is Dan's question, because I talked about this yesterday, and it is really sterile, and that was really hard for me, I have to say. But they also have artwork, so like these, and I saw them in the other place, but there were all these people working, and they were working on film, and they were doing stuff, and I felt like it was alive. And maybe my prayer is that next summer when I'm there, there'll be people working not from home, using the facility, and that we will be there among them. But yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah, Holly.
So going back to your discussion of Spiegelman's mouse and the way that he used the mice and the kind of graphic novel form as a way to touch these stories he otherwise couldn't. I was just thinking about his daughter's memoir, and what, I don't know, like if you have any ideas about like the relationship of that memoir to the kind of ways in which he's telling the family story, and how that generation removal, like, I don't know.
Well, I do think it's an essay that you could write. Really thinking about her inheritance, and I read the memoir when it came out, so it's a couple of years old, and I recommend it. It's really quite fascinating. And some of you know that she was a high school student at Stuyvesant, which is in Lower Manhattan, and she was there when the towers fell. The school was very close by, and so, as some of you know, he did a piece on the towers, and so, I mean, to be like the daughter of Spiegelman, your mother is like the visual editor, I don't know what it's called, at the New Yorker, and so there's that image of Spiegelman that's on the cover. I mean, they're just all of these things. So, like, having, for her, the overdetermination of all of these things and her trying to find her own voice. But I do think that's, I mean, this is the legacy. So, how she comes to that story is really different. Or I spent a couple of hours with Pascal Bauchier, who was telling me about her family stories and, growing up in the Netherlands. And, one of the things she was talking about was how she grew up in this neighborhood, right, where her family had always lived. So it was the site of their life before the war, before the Holocaust, right, before the war. And it was their life during, so here's where people were deported, and then they went back and they lived there. And so it has like, it's like all of it is happening at the simultaneity of those layers. And of course, we live in a country that is marred by so many legacies of violence, right? The violent taking of lands, the degradation of whole populations, and it's kind of all around us. So the monuments that are now not here, the traces that are, I think, trying to kind of, again, that sedimentation and the sort of palimpsests, I think, are really important ways of thinking about these things. So I think I mean, I don't know if she wants to write about like what it meant to be, Spiegelman's daughter when this stuff comes out, and it's like so iconic and overdetermined. So for her, I think that's really important. So. Any further comments, questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to jump back a little bit to the discussion around digitalization. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what role social media can or should or maybe should not play in the preservation of objects. I'm thinking a lot about like the relationship I have with my students where like I'll feel like I'm talking about something really interesting and I'll hear crickets in the room, and then I show a TikTok and it's like, everybody's really, really engaged. So these new forms of engagement with, especially with the younger people, what is the relationship between social media and objects? Is something lost when they enter into the social media space? And then what does that do also with like the relationship between time too? Because obviously, objects and stories are things that require a lot of time and engagement in space. And tweets and Facebook posts and TikTok are meant to be consumed really quickly. So I'm curious about that relationship.
Yeah, and then the weirdness about the archiving movement. I had a former student who was in a class that Holly was in when she was an undergraduate, and he was fascinated by who owns a tweet, and the problematics of that. Right. So, I, as you were talking, I thought about the Instagram piece about a survivor that has circulated. There have been a bunch of Anne Frank things that have kind of been using social media. I mean, some people are like, oh, it's the desecration. I don't think, I mean, it's risk. It's a risk, right? And the question is, so if you make a TikTok, who will read it? There's this brilliant woman, this like sassy Orthodox woman who has like perfect makeup. It's beyond me. And she does. There's like you study a page of Talmud a day, and it's Daf Yomi, and Daf is a page, Yom is day. So she does this like a Daf a day, and she's so sassy and she's so unbelievably smart, and she's doing it on TikTok, and so it's really quick, and she goes like, and I mean, I'm just in awe of this woman. I mean, it's just fantastic. And she's reading Talmud, like, who knew? This crazy Orthodox woman. And she's beautiful and glamorous. It's just fantastic. From my perspective, I'm sure people are horrified. Some people are horrified, but like, I am just like completely, like I might want to do this again just to kind of follow her. Maybe when I'm old, older, I'll do that. But I think that, I think we have to use the media and the mediums that are open to us, and I don't think anything is off the table. And yes, we want to be sensitive to how other people do this, but that's part of the risk, right? Because as you say, you put that TikTok up and like, like I said, even me, I got really excited. I don't even do the TikTok thing, and I don't even do Instagram. I'm like a Facebook person, as I said to people yesterday, because I'm old. But I think that, I think it's a vehicle. But as we all know from spending time on Zoom, lots and lots of time on Zoom, there's something about being in person. And I think that video and audio and Zoom and all of these things can be really helpful. But there is something important about being present. And like I was meeting with these people from the museum for the last year and a half, talking about doing this workshop. We were supposed to meet this year, but because the museum hasn't fully opened, and the research center hasn't fully opened, all of their workshops and fellowships have been online for the last 2-3 years. And so, and for us, because we were bringing together museum professionals, curators, and conservators, and collections managers, along with scholars, in the humanities and social sciences, and sort of. So for us, we needed to be hands-on, and we need to go to that offsite facility and kind of look at material objects, and that's where we're going to begin. So we decided that it was a good idea, since we got postponed, to have a meeting in Washington and kind of to talk through what we were going to do. we got more accomplished in the 2 days that we were together than we had on Zoom, right? And we were there and we got to meet with people and we got to kind of see the logistics of things. It was really important. And so we did set up Zooms so that we get the cohort to meet each other. This is a new thing. So we're meeting twice in the fall and twice in the spring, and we're trying not to overtax people. And then we're going to be, so it'll set up our being together for 2 weeks in the summer. But I think we have to think multidimensionally, right? We have to think in multimedia ways. So various mediations and materialities need to kind of coexist. So yeah, you do digital humanities, but go look at the special collections. See the first edition of that book, or look at the hand notes that might be in. I mean, you've got this amazing collection here, such an incredible archive of like American literature and art, and so many amazing people have their papers here. So and their stuff here, right? So you want to look at that stuff. Yeah, you can look at the stuff online, but go then see the stuff that you most want to see. It will make your work a little more efficient. But you still, there's something to be said for getting closer.
Okay, well, many thanks for these very interesting questions and for the great response.
Thank you. Thank you so much.